Yeah, if you get a chance to take some pictures when I'm speaking.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
We're good to go. Welcome back, everyone. My name's Ed Miller. I'm a campaigns director for economic and climate justice at GetUp, which at the moment means that primarily my work is focused on thinking about that there's 400 of you that are willing to sit down for 3 days of hardcore economics and public finance and what the future might look like. So, personally very exciting, and I think particularly so because, like many people here, I imagine, I first encountered MMT in about 2006 reading Bill's blog, and it was in many ways the start of what led me to be and want to be an activist. It not just changed my understanding of economics, but it changed the way that I saw the world and thought about things like social justice and what the state is capable of. It was a lot of my early organising efforts as well. At university, you'd throw events and speaker series, and you'd be really happy and proud if you got like 10 or 15 people in a room thinking about this stuff. And I think that today, this audience is evidence that something is pretty clearly changed. And there's a lot of different factors that have gone into that, not least the tenacity of people like Bill in sort of pushing these ideas for so many years. But I think another thing that's changed is that there's a certain rock star congresswoman in the United States who's going around name-checking MMT in public interviews and legitimizing it as a part of the discussion of how progressives generally should think about economic policy moving forward. And so it's a great delight to be able to introduce our next speaker, who as an advisor and organizer for AOC was one of the, probably singularly responsible for introducing her both to MMT and the concept of a job guarantee in that sort of history-making campaign. And Andres Bernal is now not just a political advisor and consultant for a range of pro-democracy groups and democratic groups around the world, but is also, in many ways, the next generation of MMT scholars that's pushing, the theory and the economics into the real world and into campaigns. He's a research fellow at the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. He's the outreach director for the Modern Money Network. And it's incredibly great that we've been able to bring him out to talk to us here in Adelaide, all the way from New York. I think it was a 25-hour trip. So please give Andreas a really warm welcome.
Well, hello everybody. Can everybody hear me? Yes. It's a real pleasure to be here with everybody. This is my first time in Australia. I'm very happy to be here. I want to give a very special thank you to the organizers of the conference, to Stephen, to Gabrielle. A very special thank you to Ed and the folks at GetUp. And a very special thank you to David and Joe, who have graciously taken me into their home and hosted me as my Australian mom and dad. So thank you very much. I began this journey here to the conference on Tuesday in the United States, boarded an airplane, and I landed, and then I was exhausted, and I got off the plane, and I look up, and it said, "Welcome to Los Angeles," from New York City. So that's when I realized I had 15 more hours to go, and then to Sydney, and 3 more then to Adelaide. But in all seriousness, as exhausted as I felt with that journey, I think what's even more exhausting is knowing that my president and some people in power can just, with the snap of their fingers, send us to war and assassinate people in other parts of the world without a thought. I think what's even more exhausting is that in the last 6 months, California, the Amazon, Australia, the Middle East, and probably other parts that I don't even know of are on fire. And that's way more exhausting. And so being able to travel here is a tremendous privilege, and to be here with you is an incredible honor. So thank you for that. What I'd like to do here is talk a little bit about the story of how the Green New Deal kind of emerged, this contemporary Green New Deal in the United States, a little bit about my role in it, where that kind of all started, and then also where my thinking conceptually, intellectually is going, given the different context that Green New Deal now exists. So a little bit about that story. My involvement in it kind of really starts with the fact that I immigrated to the United States when I was 3 years old. And that is a subject that's very popular and important, very controversial in these days, migration and immigration, right? I arrived in the United States in 1990, and that set a very strong foundation for how I see and understand the world, because in the United States, that oftentimes means that you're a second-class citizen and that your kind of purpose in life is to try to adjust as much as you can to the rules, the norms, and the standards of a hegemonic, dominant culture, which in the United States happens to be very much obsessed with individuality, individualism, and wealth acquisition. So one of my experiences that was very important and very formative was when I was 17 years old. I was a part of these leadership development programs, one of them which had a collection of like 200 Latinos and Latinas from across the country, and they put us in a simulated government. And they said, you all are going to give speeches, you're going to run for office, and then you're going to form a Senate, a House, and a presidency, and you're going to carry this out, and the counselors and the authority, we're not going to tell you what to do. We're just going to hold this together, and it's going to be up to you to figure this out. And that was the first time that I gave a speech as a terrified 17-year-old to a bunch of my peers, and I was running to be a Supreme Court justice, and I went off for like, I don't know how many minutes about, wanting to be all about justice and honor and all these things. And then I was elected. I won that election. I joined that little mock Supreme Court, and I felt for really one of the first times in my adult life at the time that I could do something, that I could be a part of shaping and creating my future and the future of others. And so that kind of marked this journey, which I still am, where I, on one hand, see myself as an organizer and an activist involved in the world around me, trying to make meaning of my life and the decisions that I make based on how I want to see the world, but also understanding myself as part of this greater collective whole, and the fact that we're all a part of society, and we're not living as just these individuals that are outside of our interdependencies. And so that was very important for me as well. In that organization and in those leadership development experiences, I started to hear about this upcoming and rising superstar from the Bronx. I was growing up in Texas at the time, and this organization happened to be national in scale, and so we kept hearing about this young woman from the Bronx. And finally I got to meet her, incredibly cool person, incredibly ambitious, and her name was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And we were, let's hear it for her. She's done amazing things, absolutely. So we were in our early 20s, and we were going back to these leadership development programs and whatnot as counselors and helping to allow others to experience what we had. And the really important part there is what happens when you invest in the youth, not just from an kind of a mainstream educational perspective where you just have to memorize things so that you can go get a job, and then you can just get a position and get a title, and that's in that. You get older and then you receive your award or your plaque, and that's it. You retire and that's it. Education for us has really been about how do you inspire young people to feel like they can take control of their destinies in a way that's based on values and based on critical thinking and based on transforming their lives and the lives of their peers as well. In 2014, I moved to New York City to start a PhD program in public policy after a background in philosophy and in leadership studies. And every now and then, I would hang out with my good friend Alexandria, and we would talk about politics. We would talk about, soccer, the World Cup, and it was fine, right? What was the future of the world? We didn't know, but it was, climate change was already starting to become an issue. We're thinking about that, but things didn't really get interesting until 2016, when the worst imaginable situation happened, and a reality TV show star, misogynistic, white supremacist, nationalist, lunatic was elected to be the most powerful person in our nation and arguably and perhaps in the world. But something I think we understood, that many of us understood, is that he wasn't himself the problem. He was a symptom of a sick society and a reflection of what had been building for decades on out. And that the political system and the consensus, both ideologically and institutionally, just couldn't hold it together anymore. Some people call that neoliberalism. The neoliberal power system and rationalizing ideology couldn't hold it together anymore, and things were falling into a crisis. And we started to see that and we were seeing that all around the world, as many of the advisors that write Trump's speeches, that help get him into office, are traveling to all different parts of the world to inspire those same movements to go on. And that this is happening at a time when we are facing an environmental catastrophe and crisis looming around us, making people more afraid, emphasizing scarcity more than that. And so it was just incredibly disturbing, and a time where we just really had to go into deep self-reflection. In December of 2016, after Donald Trump was elected, but before he was inaugurated into office, Alexandria decided to go, and I actually just discovered, I went back this morning on Facebook to see what date it was. It was December of 2016. She went on a road trip to Standing Rock. So in the United States, Standing Rock in North Dakota has a sacred indigenous area, and the U.S. government, along with some private entities, were going to force a pipeline through that area and practice fracking. And so a whole controversy evolved around it, where people from all around the country were going to Standing Rock to protest this and to come together with the elders of that community in resistance. So she went over to Standing Rock. On her way over there, she passed by Flint, Michigan, which is, of course, famous in the United States for the toxic lead in the water that to this day is still killing children and giving brain damage and all kinds of other problems. So she stopped by Flint. She went to Standing Rock. She participated in many of these protests. She sat there with the elders, and she left that experience making a crazy, wild decision to run for office. She had been involved in much of the organizing for the Bernie Sanders campaign and other people who were part of that movement, which really came from many who were part of Occupy Wall Street, who before then were the people that helped get Barack Obama elected, who before that come from this legacy of the same people who were protesting the WTO in the late 90s in Seattle, which is also very famous. So that kind of ended up as a part of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and then people wanted to build organizations and movements that can get more people like Bernie elected and just try something different. So she was supported by Justice Democrats, which is an organization that formed to try to get different kinds of people elected into office. And she decided to throw what we call in the United States a Hail Mary and run for office in what seemed to be an impossible situation. So I said, I'm going to help you out. I'm getting my PhD and in policy. I think I can be of a lot of help to this thing that you're trying to build. And what emerged from that was absolutely incredible and insightful, because little by little, even though nobody took her seriously, even though a lot of people didn't even know who she was, the incumbent at the time, Joe Crawley, didn't even show up for one of the debates. We were very much focused on trying to build a social movement in that district. And that meant inspiring people by being unapologetically progressive, to bring them out and to participate, to make it not just about her, but about what this community can accomplish together. So people went out and started knocking on doors. We had everybody from stand-up comedians to aspiring actors to teachers, who all were bringing their unique skill sets, introverts and extroverts, everybody coming out trying to see how they could convince more people to vote for her in the primary. And little by little, even though it seemed like such an impossible task, it seemed as though the right pieces all came together. When they finally had debates, she just really destroyed him, because he wasn't ready for somebody who was going to unapologetically say progressive things, who was going to say, in the United States, we deserve universal health care, who was going to say, we need to act boldly on climate change, and who, at the time, close to where I grew up in South Texas, the Trump administration was separating families and placing people in concentration camps on the border, that institution, ICE, needed to be abolished. And she was unapologetic about all of that. And I think an establishment person just didn't know how to respond to to this kind of energy that was inspiring and mobilized so many people. In addition to that, I think that Alexandria had something really, really interesting and unique, and that is that in an era of optics and shallowness, where the legacy of the civil rights movement and the women's movement, which were trying to emphasize the importance that we could not ignore any longer, that these people who were part of certain social categories had been marginalized, and that we had to organize in order to reach some kind of justice based on this, that in the era that we call neoliberalism, much of that was exploited to produce kind of these optics that ignored the real institutional, material way that people had been marginalized. She was able to bring that force, the reality that she is also part of the Hispanic or Latino diaspora in the United States from Puerto Rico, which Puerto Rico is treated like a colony, was colonized by the United States, that she is a young woman who, when her father passed away of cancer, her home was going to be foreclosed on, and she, after graduating from a good university in economics, was forced to have to work and no longer pursue her interest in higher education, just to take care of her mother so they wouldn't lose their home. All of that made it very clear that the marginalization of certain social groups was deeply connected with class as well, that both of those things could coexist, and that one could lead a movement that could inspire the importance of women's rights, people of color's rights, with class too. And when she was able to articulate that vision, it was something that I think in the United States we hadn't really heard of yet. And so she won. It was an incredible thing. She pulled it off, and she won that campaign. And after that, I think that politics in the United States has not been the same. The history of environmental politics in the U.S. it kind of started in the 1970s, but very quickly after that, business interests and very conservative groups were able to create this notion that we have to choose either the environment or the economy, and they're infinitely opposed to one another. And it's a zero-sum game, essentially. And up until then, we had tried to address environmental issues using market logic by trying to incentivize cap-and-trade systems or use carbon taxes or try to regulate in a way that still gave agency and authority to multinational corporations who decided if they wanted to follow through with the regulations or not. The ball was in their court. The debate was on their terms, and had been that way for 50 years. After she won, on her way to go to orientation, on her way to Washington, D.C., she stopped in Philadelphia, where there was a group of activists who were part of an organization called the Sunrise Movement. And they told her, we're going to go occupy Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House's office, demanding that we act on climate change now, and demanding a Green New Deal. And she thought to herself, in her words, holy shit. Because she just got elected. Is she already going to be a rabble-rouser from the very beginning? She doesn't know what to expect. And she decides, you know what? I'm going to go for it. I'm going to do it. I'm going to go. I'm going to occupy Nancy Pelosi's office. And I'm going to do it in a way that's thoughtful and that's strategic, so we can start to shift the conversation right away. And after that moment, after the Sunrise, or about more than 100 people, young students from the Sunrise organization, and Alexandria occupied that office, the Green New Deal all of a sudden became and moved to the forefront of the policy agenda in the United States. And no longer were we talking about, well, let's try to do some cap and trade here, let's try to put a carbon tax here. All of a sudden we were talking about doing a mass transformational mobilization of resources to move beyond the fossil fuel economy, and we wouldn't accept anything less than that, and that movement was going to be grounded in social justice values, because there was an understanding that to produce a new kind of economy, you had to see the way that the very system that is polluting, that is creating waste and toxicity, and essentially producing all of the carbon dioxide that's leading to climate change is the same system that is creating poverty, that is exploiting people, and that is creating mass misery in the United States and around the world. And so you cannot separate these two things from one another. So the notion of a Green New Deal was born at that time in a kind of a very strong political way. Central to the Green New Deal, in addition to a mass mobilization that creates millions of jobs, good-paying jobs, union jobs, is this notion of environmental justice, as I just mentioned, that a transition towards a post-fossil fuel economy had to be based on being a just transition, that even coal miners who had spent their whole lives working in and for the fossil fuel industry were not at fault for this, that their pensions mattered, and that it mattered that we can transition them to continue experiencing or to experience more dignity that they were in their lives. That notion started to come to the forefront, that we just had to start thinking about the quality of how we produce things and the quality of the output that our economy produces, that these things are socially constructed and they're up for contestation, that we can use our minds to rethink how we produce and what we produce, and that it was up to us to mobilize in the same way, as she often says, as if we were going to war, except rather than trying to kill one another, we have to mobilize to save ourselves from the system that's killing us. So where does MMT come into play into all of this? Well, for me, it just so happened that as she's running for office, I started to read up on MMT because I was so frustrated that we couldn't accomplish anything in the United States without this stupid question of how are you going to pay for it? As if, it didn't seem plausible that the full complexity of an economy could be reduced to such petty notions like finding the money. Before that, I had been trained in critical theory and political economy. And so I was really interested in notions of power, thinking about class, thinking about power in homes, in the household, how private life is organized, social reproduction. Somebody mentioned that yesterday. Thinking about the discourses and narratives that rationalize this power, the way that we rationalize the very injustice that we live by articulating certain worldviews on a daily basis. And one of the things that I had always been really skeptical of was the notion that there is this economy that exists out there in nature, as if you could plant some central banks and they can just grow. Or as if the history of the universe was, the Big Bang, matter, stars, inflation. I don't know, right? So I was very much questioning the notion that there's an independent category of an economy organized by these rational actors who were creating or who were a part of these laws, economic laws that were regulating the market economy that pre-existed states and all of society. I've been very influenced by the work of people like Karl Polanyi, who argued that the economy is itself embedded in institutions, in rules, in laws, in power dynamics, and if we deconstruct markets, if we deconstruct all of these things, it's just people. It's people organizing the world with one another, making meaning of the world, and creating different ways that we can coexist through different power relations. So when I started to read about MMT, something that was very interesting to me right away was that money, this thing that we always are taught emerged out of barter because rational actors discovered that they would be more efficient to barter if they used money, was nonsense. That at the very beginning of what we call money, some form of organization or authority was trying to provision itself and issuing different forms of debts and obligations in order to do this. Mediating a social world through debts and obligations and forms of redemption. You had to redeem your debts and obligations, which we can call taxes and fees now. that this notion of a currency, is a unit of account, social inventions, cultural artifacts that we create to help us organize things. So it started to make a lot of sense to me. The notion that a government is like a household, it became very easy to debunk that when we start to understand somebody's issuing it, and somebody's using that thing we're calling a currency. So from that moment, once I understood the difference in these kind of stories of money, it became very, obvious to me that MMT allowed us and shed light, illuminated how our macroeconomic system exists by seeing the different kinds of structures that are keeping it that way, right? We understand money is a legal relation, a legal and a social relation of power. And we see central banks are doing things based on different kinds of rules that are structuring them. So moving away from this notion of a natural economy that exists out there. So all of that is really important for me. So why is this important for MMT in the context of the Green New Deal? Well, I think one of the most effective things about neoliberalism and the legacy of Thatcher and Reagan is that they were able to convince all parties, including oppositional parties, that they were right, essentially, and to argue on their terms. So in the United States, after Reagan, all of the Democrats just subtly and implicitly accepted that they were right, and that maybe they could try to do things a little bit more humanely, even though that's in and of itself arguable. But even the left, in a lot of circumstances, when you have sometimes even Marxists who are talking about being sound finance socialists, that doesn't make any sense. It is giving and attributing way too much power to neoliberal myths about the way money operates that is naturalizing this thing that we call money. So it just so happened that as Alexandria was getting closer and closer to her primary, I was learning more and more about MMT, meeting several of the very key scholars, learning a great deal. And so I was able to work with her to see the importance of a jobs guarantee, in the sense that it encourages social and political participation, rather than just, the other idea that was up for grabs was the UBI, rather than just reducing people to passive consumers and participating in a world that in the future is going to be creating value based on these tech monopolies. But instead of doing that, the idea of a jobs guarantee encourages us to come together to produce value and participate in an economy. It has its legacy in the civil rights movement and in Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And so once we put that on the platform, it became incredibly popular. Right away, both the Green New Deal, because it emphasized the mass mobilization, because it emphasized environmental justice, and the jobs guarantee became two of the most popular policy agendas in the United States. So we started to restructure the grip that neoliberalism had in the public imagination. And I think that's key, because at the end of the day, it's going to be very difficult to transform or transcend the limits of our neoliberal, capitalist, fossil fuel-based economy if we can't even imagine how things might look beyond that. So it's very important to rediscover our public imagination and our civic imagination by doing this. So where we are now, we gained a lot of victories. Alexandria has been critical in certain interviews and things that she has said, which has opened up the debate for MMT. But of course, we're still in a ideological and political battle about what is really going to shape this Green New Deal moving forward, and why is MMT so important to this. So in the United States, I would say that there's three dominant visions about how a Green New Deal is going to be financed. And this is very important because, MMT allows us to see the central role of money in any kind of political economy. In that how we use policy, how we spend, is something that is up for political struggle as well. One of the visions is to create a network of public banks around the United States to be financing a Green New Deal. And we've been pushing back against this by saying, look, public banks are great. In fact, socializing investment is probably a good thing. But do you really want to finance the thing that's supposed to save the planet by lending and issuing credit? It has to be repaid. We already have seen what has happened with that with student loans in the United States. It didn't turn out too well. So one of those battles has been on that, on trying to help progressives in the left understand that while public banks are desirable, public spending and fiscal policy is critical for things that are not up for debate in terms of, like, do we want to do lending or do we want to just pay for it? Responding to climate change is too important and too urgent to not see how this should be at the forefront of that movement. The second one, of course, that's very popular is to say, well, we're going to tax the rich. We're going to pay for the Green New Deal. We're going to find the money by taxing the rich. We're going to collect that money and redistribute it. I hear it from many, many people. Well, the problem with that, one of the major problems with that is you need them to stay rich so you can keep taxing them so that you can pay for what you need. And you have to, on top of that, fight that other political battle of convincing enough people, because what ends up happening is people start asking for the calculations and the numbers, and then you start, well, okay, we got this tax rate on these people in this bracket over here, and then this whole notion of the middle class comes into play, and then people get really upset, and you never win. And that has been, in large part, the last 30 years of policy too. So what we've been trying to do on that ground is obviously emphasize the importance of taxing the rich, but for other purposes. We want to tax the rich because they've taken over democracies. We want to tax the rich because it's the right thing to do, because inequality has gotten out of control. And my latest favorite one is, we want to tax the rich because we want to disrupt their monopoly power over price setting and over markets. Not because we need their money. Not because we depend on them to be able to do what's right to save the planet, to provide people with health care, to provide people with what they need, to provide people with the right to a dignified job, etc. Because there's this whole thing now where the many of the elites feel like, well, I've had somebody tell me my taxes pay for 3 families. It's kind of a destructive, problematic ideology as well. So we want to tax the rich because it's the politically right thing to do, but we want to decouple that from how we spend, because it's both not true and it's also not politically effective. Once we understand that when we spend, we can start meeting our urgent needs now. We can start thinking about things in terms of real resources, which Stephanie spoke very elegantly about yesterday. We can see that that's the conversation. The conversation is about how do we want to use our resources, our productive capacity, our labor, our technology. Where do we have shortages? What do we need to build more of? Those things become central to the conversation, which I think is absolutely key. We also have introduced this idea of non-fiscal pay-fors. So when people say, how are you going to pay for it? We have non-fiscal pay-fors. We pay for things by resourcing them. We pay for things by explaining to people, this is what we're going to use. We need these engineers to build these solar panels. We need to train these farmers to use these regenerative agriculture practices. That's what we need to do, right? So it takes the conversation on our terms. The question of inflation, of course, many of my colleagues and I have talked about how MMTs are the only people articulating an effective description and analysis of what actually is inflation. There's still so many people that believe that inflation is some natural law out there, that if you spend too much, somehow the money just loses its value in some strange metaphysical way. I don't know, it's like, I think of Star Wars and like midichlorians. I don't know if I'm aging myself there or something. But to think about inflation in terms of like the real structural social relations that exist, what's getting produced? Are there monopolists that are inflating prices? In the United States, we have healthcare, housing, energy, and education, which is completely inflated right now. Nobody talks about that as being inflated. Those monopolies have to be disrupted so that we can create the fiscal space to do other things, to get the Green New Deal. We're not talking about the way that private banks are creating bubbles and inflating and creating inflation with their irresponsible predatory lending, which essentially is another form of issuing money and creating money, but with the caveat of it being of having a very high interest and all of these other kinds of problems, because our governments have not taken the responsibility to use fiscal policy. We have created a generation that is in private debt, getting more credit cards. We have been able to maintain the demand necessary for the economy to not fall apart, even though it did in 2008, based on private debt and credit cards. That needs to go as well. When we put real regulations on private banks, we're opening up more resources, again, to be able to accomplish things that we want. So we think that's incredibly important as well. Thank you. And so these things are all part of the debate right now, in how we understand our task. How do we understand what we need to accomplish in order to address this climate crisis, which is also grounded in a social crisis too. I think another very important thing that MMT allows us to do is to understand that concepts like economic growth, work, and value are also subjective and socially and culturally constructed too. And as the presenters who spoke so greatly on the history of indigenous movements here in Australia, there's a lot that we have to learn from the ways other cultures and other communities have understood work, growth, development, and different forms of social relations too. And we can incorporate them. There's nothing to say that we can't incorporate those things into who we are as well. There's nothing to say that we can't move forward. I love yesterday somebody mentioned that we are all going to go to Mars together and explore space. I think that's a beautiful idea. There's nothing to say that we can't do that while also learning from the past that we oftentimes don't think about because it's painful to come to terms with the violence in ourselves and in our own histories too. So that's a very important part of the work that we're doing. Another big piece of what I'm doing at least is thinking about how do we democratize the state. We know that sovereign currency issuing nations have the capacity to spend, but how do we decide how we use that money, who gets to be involved? I think there's something to say about the importance of instituting different ways of democratizing the state so that the way that we coordinate investment and production becomes more of a public and a social democratic process. I think that's absolutely critical in our work. And so for the Green New Deal, this is very important because I oftentimes hear from many local groups in state and local governments, what do we do, right? We can't do MMT, we can't do MMT. We can't issue our own currency at this level, right? What can we do? So I think there's a lot to learn about how at the local level people can organize, because we need data, we need information about resources. And who knows resources better than the people who actually live in these communities? They have the information. They live there. They're experiencing the injustices. They know the needs, and they know what capacity they have as well. So once we're able to break away from this binary of like local versus national, we can start to see how we can collaborate together on different levels. So that's a very important part as well. And lastly, I'll kind of end with some of the work that's become really important to me as well, which is to, and one of the criticisms of MMT is that it's American-centric, that it only works because American has the reserve currency, all this nonsense. I have returned to Colombia, which is where I was born, and Latin America to start talking about how we can think about using the MMT lens for the issues of the legacy of imperialism, colonization, and how we mobilize those movements there as well. Because at the end of the day, to address the climate crisis and to also create a better world, we have to understand that this is a global movement. It has to be a global. It's an international global movement that is key. And so MMT allows the global south to think about, well, why can't our currencies do much? How come we depend on these powerful countries for our technology, for our energy system, for our food? How come we're just exporting all of our raw materials and not getting anything out of it? How come we're experiencing a crisis of unemployment? So all of a sudden we're exposing all of these issues which are related to power, which are related to domination, and we can organize ourselves so that when we start to potentially win, we can start to institute policies and movements that can rebuild productive capacity in different parts of the world on sustainable grounds. Yes. And so, thank you. And so that's the idea. That's where we're at now. Being here in Australia is amazing because it shows that we're building this sense of connection with many people around the world. Working together, we are trying to improve and meet the needs of our individual countries and nations, which have unique histories and unique experiences, and that's great, but we can also do that in a way that understands that it's ultimately an international global fight. Because what's at stake here is eco-fascism. Because as the climate crisis intensifies, people are going to retreat more and more into what they feel is some form of safety. More and more of these authoritarians are going to be saying that they'll protect them by scapegoating migrants, by always scapegoating the most vulnerable, by exploiting our emotional tendency to feel like, who are the people that I look like the most? How can I connect with them and blame other people? And that's going to be happening more and more as the climate crisis intensifies if we can't offer an alternative. And so to be able to fight for what is right, to gain different forms of national agency and sovereignty, which is we need, but also understand that it's connected to an entire global struggle, is at the core of what I see as an MMT-informed international agenda for sustainability and for a just transition. Thank you.
Keep a round of applause going for Andreas. We've got 10 to 15 minutes now for questions, and we might start up the back here. I don't know if there's roaming microphones, so I might just run this around.
Thank you. That was very inspiring.
Thank you.
I'm really interested in your building a global network and the way you're trying to do it. I just would like your opinion about another way that another country is currently seeming to build a global network, which is China, which is just investing everywhere and lending money to everyone and building a very interesting global network. And how does that all fit? Because it kind of scares me. It's probably because I don't understand enough of it.
Wow, what a question. Well, look, I think that there are things to learn from the Chinese experience. I think that they certainly have understood how to coordinate certain things in ways that can be effective. They are investing a lot on renewable energy, but I think that there are many questions about is it really in the African nations where China is investing? Is it really in their best interest? I think that certain political rights are key, and I will stand firm on them as well, which I think they're questionable in certain experiences. And so I think that we need to be able to judge the importance of breaking away from certain kinds of neoliberal market orthodoxy, but also affirm the importance of political rights as well. We can affirm an economic Bill of Rights and the need to lift people out of poverty in the way that China has been able to do, while also affirming certain political rights too. So,
There's a woman down in the centre with her hand up, but I'll just go to...
Thanks very much for the talk. My name's Colin Long. I work on just transitions for the Victorian trade union movement. One of the biggest problems for trade unions, or for in relation to the transition, is that renewable energy jobs tend to be pretty poor quality jobs in this country, bad pay, insecurely employed, and so on. And there's not that many of them, to be honest. Wondering what the situation is in the US and what sort of policies that you're advocating to deal with the issue of labour standards in the renewable energy sector in particular.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. One of the things that I saw was critical after her Alexandria's election, and as we were kind of trying to think in a more macro way, was to create relationships and an alliance between the Modern Money Network and kind of our vision with labor. And I got to meet Sarah Nelson, who is doing some amazing things in the United States as the president of the Flight Attendants Union. And many people were saying that the Green New Deal was going to, from one day to another, end all flights, and that was part of the right's tactic. And Sarah Nelson understood that the best interests of her union members was dealing with the climate crisis as well. And she's doing an incredible job in rebuilding a labor movement in the United States. So, I mean, short answer is we need to rebuild the labor movement all around the world to tackle the devastation. Yes, absolutely. To tackle the devastation that neoliberal policies have created in workplaces and in firms, and to ground our vision to create this mass mobilization that we need to produce all the renewable energy systems that we need in jobs that are unionized and that are paying good wages with good working conditions. I mean, it's critical. So I'm very much from a social movement perspective. We need to build that labor movement and get the victories that we need legislatively.
Hi, I've got a couple of questions, or two-part question.
Okay.
How similar or different is the Green New Deal that you're working on to the Greens that Jill Stein ran on in 2016? Uh-huh. And are you and the Greens interested or able to work together to push that forward?
Well, you got to give credit to the Greens for doing a lot of work to at least start that conversation in the United States. Because before the Greens, Thomas Friedman Thomas Friedman, he wrote kind of the first article where he named the Green New Deal. Now, he's a neoliberal, so for him, the Green New Deal was cap and trade. Let's do massive cap and trade, to transition to renewable energy. And then after that, during Barack Obama's tenure, he appointed Van Jones to be head of renewable energy, and his vision was that the private sector was the only sector or institute or area that had the resources to produce what we needed to overcome climate change. So that was the thinking. I mean, the thinking was we're going to inspire all of these green entrepreneurs to become green capitalists and address the climate crisis that way. And so the Green Party did a very important job of at least getting that conversation going. I think that there were a lot of uncertainties going back to this question of how do you pay for it. There have been a lot of uncertainties amongst the left with what is the best agenda that we should have. And all of this confusion around should we get a bunch of public banks, people talking about quantitative easing without really understanding what it was, like all of these buzzwords, that was all part of the confusion that I think we're really trying to address and get over at this point.
Any more questions, especially up the back? We haven't heard from anyone up there. If not, there's a woman up there in the middle.
Just going to make a quick comment before my question, which is that I'm a bit concerned about using the term eco-fascism. I feel like it embeds eco with fascism, and it just is not a metaphor we want to get. Fascism is fascism. Anyway, just a comment. I'd like to hear more about the relationship of local government or local communities and federal funding, and where the state fits into that, and how much thought has gone what sort of conversations are having about that?
Some of the conversations about that involve things like participatory budgeting. Porto Alegre in Brazil did some experiments with that, and that moved over to New York City, and there's been experiments and conversations around growing interest in participatory budgeting, in creating citizens' assemblies as well that can create more democratic power to counterbalance what has become a completely co-opted Congress in the United States and around the world as well. So I think that's where we start that conversation. I mean, how do we... I'll say this. Part of the difficulty with that is that people are exhausted because we work too much and we're paid too little. So I think in order to get there, we really have to push for reducing the work week and how much we work without reducing people's standard of living, quality of life. So I think like those two things go hand in hand.
Hi, Andreas. Thanks so much for making the jump across the pond. My name's Kent, and first of all, I just want to say thank you for your work on the Green New Deal with AOC. These ideas catch fire. So we'll mention this so much in our organization within Democrats abroad, being the Australia chair. We've endorsed it and we'll be arguing it in the party platform coming up, so thank you on that. My big question is, having these old ideas of neoliberalism and so forth that have put the economy and the environment in these mutually exclusive categories, what is sort of the biggest, and knowing how much of a myth that is in the United States as well, how embedded that is, what was sort of the biggest work or biggest convincing point you had to do to shift people sort of away from that, or to not see these as mutually exclusive or binary, and to see these interconnected at sort of a grassroots level? So yeah, just really curious what was the biggest sort of roadblock for that?
Which interconnections in particular?
Just with there still is the argument that says like the economy is different from the environment. We have to choose, sort of make this choice between one or the other. I mean, obviously we know that it's interconnected, but there still is that myth. So I guess some advice on the persuasion around that, how to see them more interconnected.
Yeah, one thing that's been effective is to put it in the time to get to know people in communities. This is a lesson for the importance of organizing as well, and to meet people where they're at, to make that attempt, and to draw connections between what's happening in their quality of life. Because people are sick, asthma rates are through the roof, cancer rates are rising. In areas, in Texas, the Rio Grande River, there's parts that are so contaminated, especially on the Mexican side, that the rate of children being born without parts of their brain is like 10 times the average. So there's a part in Mississippi, I believe, that's called Cancer Alley, because everybody that lives there, has cancer because there's a very large amount of pesticide companies that are out there. The mental health crisis. So drawing these connections of how you are experiencing your life, the struggles that you have, the costs that you have, it's not just your fault. It's not just random. This is connected to policy. This is connected to these things here. And articulating that in ways that are accessible is, in my opinion, how you do it. And what we're seeing in the lack of creating these messages is that people are going to conspiracy theories too. And part of like this whole post-truth situation that we're in is really connected with our expert, technologically advanced world not being able to connect with normal people. So people are going to find ways to make sense of that, and they're going to go to crazywebsite.com that it's saying it's these people's fault or something like that. So.
Before we run into the real resource constraint of time, there's one up next to Stephen for a final question. He can potentially after this question if we've got time. Yeah, if we can extend. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, hi. We're coming up against real ecological limits. I mean, they're just there. How can democratic principles and the Green New Deal in communities even really deal with that? When we run out of water, people have to move, but they don't want to. So how do we deal with that?
Well, look, I don't claim to have, Stephanie mentioned this yesterday, I don't claim to have all the answers either, but the way I see it, democratic processes and democratic deliberation can increase our practices of self-reflection to be a bit more critical about how we organize ourselves. I think that part of the problems with overconsumption and this kind of obsession with infinite growth in a very destructive way is not being led by average working people. It's being led by those that are benefiting from it and are becoming incredibly powerful from that system too. And the people who are suffering the consequences of all of the waste and the toxicity that system produces are those that are already socially marginalized. And so when we bring people in to the, as Bernie likes to call it, when we bring people into the political process, we can have difficult conversations and place real limits as to how we organize ourselves. I mean, I remember I was in a community in Colombia, and people were resisting some of the mining that was going on in the mountains. But at the same time, some people from those communities wanted to have a soccer field because they believed they had a right, their children had a right to leisure, to infrastructure for leisure. And so what they were telling me is that ultimately they found a balance. Through a lot of debate and through a lot of conversation, they were able to find a balance to use resources to a lesser degree, to have some infrastructure for people to use for their leisure, their fun for public benefit, while respecting the natural ecological limits that existed in the ecosystem as a whole. So it's one way. I don't know if that's the answer, but it's one thing to consider.
And now the final question.
Just before John makes the final question, I'd just like to point out to everybody that this is former Senator John Coulter, who was a leader of the Democratic Party, or Democrats, sorry, the Australian Democrats, and just to put that into context. Go ahead.
Who tried for 8 years to change things in Australia, but in my valedictory speech when I left the Senate, I said I had failed. And one of the things that concerns me very much about most of the talks that we've heard today, including your own, and follows the last question, and that is that the economy is a subset of society, and society is a subset of the natural world. You mentioned climate change quite a lot, but climate change is only a symptom. Climate change is an important symptom, but it's only one of dozens and dozens of symptoms that humanity is living unsustainably. Now, the figures over the last couple of decades for Australia's footprint shows that if everybody in the world lived like Australians, we'd need between 4 and 6 planets. So the extent to which the economy has to be reduced to fit within the natural world means that as Australians we have to come back to something like 1/4 of the total size of the economy. And I wonder if you'd care to comment on that. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for your question and for being here. Well, the way I try to grapple with that question, because sometimes there are sometimes cases where that idea is argued in ways that seem to affect countries that are experiencing the most amount of poverty, where people need to get out of those conditions soon, while the global north is kind of enjoying this, abundance of extractive and destructive growth. As I said earlier, I think that growth is a concept that we invented, and it could be redefined as well. And I think right now growth means building more stuff, owning more stuff, having 50 pairs of shoes, bringing food from across the world so you can eat something. And I think that is what's incredibly destructive. I think that we can thrive and flourish in ways that we grow and develop without needing to infinitely extract and expand. And I think it has to do with growing and investing in who we are as people, in our learning, in our capacity to take care of one another, and to grow as creative, intellectual, ethical beings. That would be my answer.
On that note, another big round of applause for Andres. Thanks, mate.
And it's lunchtime, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
We've lost our little stick-in thing. Was there ever one there, or is it just...